Do you remember the question we ended with in the last episode? What if we really are the last generation to work alone? Now imagine this. It's 7:43 on a Monday morning. An entire office is already working. Reports are being updated. Presentations are being prepared. Market research is arriving. Code is being reviewed. Documents are printing. Coffee is still warm. But there's only one person in the building. No conversations. No meetings. No keyboards echoing across the room. Just one human, standing in the middle of work that somehow never stopped. For a moment, it doesn't even make sense. Because for more than a century, we've assumed something simple. If work is happening, people must be doing it. But what if that's no longer true? What if the most important change in work isn't that AI becomes your coworker? It's that you become responsible for an entire workforce that isn't human. That sounds impossible. Until you realize, history has quietly been preparing us for moments exactly like this. Think about how we used to measure value. How much can you produce? How much can you write? How much can you design? How much can you analyze? Your career, your promotions, your reputation have all been built around one question. How much valuable work can one person do? But every system is designed for a particular era. Factories rewarded physical strength. The computer rewarded technical skill. The internet rewarded access to information. And the next era may reward something completely different. Not the person who can do the most work, but the person who can coordinate the most capable work. The best way to understand that shift is to think about an orchestra. Most people remember the violin, the piano, the drums. Very few remember the conductor, because the conductor doesn't play every instrument. The conductor makes sure every instrument plays at the right moment. For generations, our careers rewarded us for becoming better musicians. Now, for the first time, the opportunity may belong to the people who learn how to conduct. Not because they're replacing musicians, but because the performance has become too large for one person to play alone. And that's where the real story begins. Because if the way we measure value is changing, then the next question isn't whether AI will take your job. The next question is far more personal. What happens when your future team isn't made of people at all? The answer begins with a normal Monday morning. The first project arrives. Nothing extraordinary. A market report that needs to be finished before noon. A few years ago, that would have meant opening dozens of browser tabs, reading articles, collecting data, writing notes, building slides, checking numbers. Hours of focused work, done by one person. But this morning, something different happens. Instead of opening the first document, the objective is defined. Understand the market, find the latest trends, identify the biggest risks, prepare 3 possible strategies. Within seconds, the work begins. Not by one system, by many. One starts gathering information from trusted sources. Another compares trends across industries. Another drafts the first version of the report. Another searches for weaknesses in the argument. Another reviews the numbers for inconsistencies. The room is still silent. Yet progress is everywhere. At first, it feels almost magical, until something goes wrong. One report confidently cites outdated information. Another reaches the right conclusion, using the wrong evidence. A third produces a presentation that looks polished, but quietly misses the most important risk. For a moment, everything slows down, not because the system stopped working, because someone has to decide which answers deserve to be trusted. And suddenly, the role inside that office becomes much clearer. The job isn't to personally perform every task anymore. The job is to understand the objective, question the results, remove the weak ideas, combine the strongest ones, and take responsibility for the final decision. Just like an orchestra, every musician can play beautifully, but if everyone plays independently, the audience doesn't hear music, they hear noise. The conductor doesn't create every note. The conductor creates harmony. Maybe that's why the future of work isn't really about artificial intelligence. It's about coordination, about knowing what should happen next, even when dozens of capable systems are waiting for direction. And if that sounds like a scene from the distant future, there's one question we have to answer before we go any further. How much of this is already happening today? More than most people realize, but probably less than the headlines want you to believe. That's what makes this moment so unusual. Because the biggest change isn't happening in public. It's happening quietly, inside the way work itself is being redesigned. If you listen carefully, the language has changed. Not long ago, the conversation was almost entirely about AI chatbots, how well they could write, how naturally they could talk, how human they sounded. Today, a different conversation is taking shape. Across workplace research, enterprise software, and AI companies, the focus is steadily moving towards something else. Not conversation, contribution. Not asking AI a question, delegating an outcome. The goal is no longer to generate another paragraph. It's to complete an entire piece of work. That shift matters because it changes the relationship between people and technology. Previous software usually waited for instructions. These new systems are increasingly being designed to carry out sequences of work, while people define objectives, review results, and remain responsible for the final outcome. That doesn't mean they can replace an experienced team. Not today. They still make mistakes. They misunderstand context. They can sound confident while being completely wrong. Some tasks still require deep expertise. Some decisions demand human accountability, and many organizations are still experimenting to understand where these systems are genuinely useful and where they are not. But history suggests something interesting. When calculators appeared, mathematicians didn't disappear. The calculations changed. When spreadsheets arrived, accountants didn't vanish. The workflow changed. When the internet connected the world, businesses didn't stop operating. They reorganized around a completely new way of working. Every major technological shift follows a similar pattern. First, the tool improves. Then, the workflow changes. And eventually, the role of the human changes with it. That may be where we are now. Across enterprise AI research, new workplace studies, and the direction of today's leading AI companies, the same pattern keeps appearing. People aren't simply asking AI more questions. They're beginning to hand over complete pieces of work. Not because AI is becoming perfect, but because even imperfect systems can become remarkably useful when they're coordinated carefully, checked thoughtfully, and guided toward a clear objective. Which brings us back to that nearly empty office. The most important person in the room was never the fastest worker. It was the person who understood what every system was trying to accomplish, what each one had misunderstood, and what the final outcome was supposed to be. And once you truly understand that, the story stops being about artificial intelligence. It becomes a story about identity. Because if the work is changing, then perhaps the person doing the work has to change too. The next morning, the project is almost finished. The research has been gathered. The analysis is complete. The presentation looks polished. Every chart is clean. Every sentence sounds confident. Everything appears ready to send. Almost. Just before approving it, something feels wrong. One statistic appears in 3 different places. Every system repeated it. Every conclusion depends on it. It looks convincing. It even comes from a source that seems trustworthy. But after checking the original report, one small detail changes everything. The number is outdated. It had already been corrected weeks earlier. In just a few seconds, one mistake had quietly spread across an entire chain of work. The systems didn't lie. They simply didn't know what they didn't know. And that's the difference. Knowledge can be generated. Responsibility cannot. Maybe that's the misunderstanding at the center of this entire conversation. People imagine the future as a competition between humans and artificial intelligence. But what if that's the wrong comparison? What if the real difference isn't who can produce more work, but who can be trusted when the work matters most? For decades, experience meant knowing how to complete the task yourself. The next chapter of work may ask something completely different. Can you recognize when a beautiful answer is actually the wrong answer? Can you slow everything down when every system is telling you to move faster? Can you carry the weight of a decision even if you didn't personally produce every page, every chart, or every line. Those aren't technical abilities. They're deeply human ones. The orchestra doesn't become extraordinary because every musician is perfect. It becomes extraordinary because someone can hear when a single instrument falls out of rhythm before everyone else does. Perhaps that's what the future is really rewarding. Not the person who can generate the most information, the person who knows which information deserves to become reality. The more capable these systems become, the more valuable that responsibility becomes. Because abundance changes the question. When intelligence becomes easier to generate, discernment becomes harder to replace. And maybe that's the biggest career shift of all. Your future value may not come from having all the answers. It may come from knowing which answer is worth trusting. The worker inside that office hasn't become less important. The job has simply become different. Not every decision begins with creating. Some begin with choosing. Some begin with questioning. Some begin with saying, "No, let's look again." And that single decision may become more valuable than everything the machines created before it. So if that's what one ordinary project looks like today, what happens when this way of working becomes ordinary for entire companies? The office is quiet again. The same desks, the same glowing monitors, the same reports moving from one screen to another, the same printer finishing another document, and still, only one person is there. At first, that image felt impossible. Now, it feels different. Because you understand what you're actually looking at. Not a company without people, not machines replacing everyone, but one person standing at the center of a system that can accomplish far more than any individual ever could alone. Maybe that's why the title of this episode isn't really about the number. The first person to manage 100 AI employees was never a prediction that someone will literally have 100 names on an organizational chart. It's a symbol of something much bigger. For the first time in history, one person's influence may no longer be limited by the number of hours they can personally work. Instead, it may be limited by how well they can coordinate, question, and guide an expanding network of intelligent systems. That's a completely different definition of productivity, and perhaps a completely different definition of leadership. Think about the conductor one last time. When the performance ends, the audience applauds the orchestra. Very few people remember that the conductor never played a single note, yet every note carried their intention. Maybe the future of work will feel the same. The most valuable people may not be the ones creating every piece of work themselves. They may be the ones who can bring the best work out of many different forms of intelligence, while accepting responsibility for every final decision, because that's the part no machine can outsource. Responsibility, trust, judgment, those have always belonged to people, and perhaps they always will. The last generation proved what one person could accomplish alone. The next generation may discover what one person can accomplish by conducting an entire workforce that never existed before. Not because humans became less important, but because human importance moved to a different place. If this episode made you rethink what your future career could look like, I want to ask you something. When AI can help create almost anything, what do you think will become the most valuable human skill? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to understand the future before it becomes the present, subscribe to the Nexovian. Because this series isn't about chasing AI headlines. It's about understanding the forces that will reshape the way we all live and work. But this story doesn't end here. Because once one person can create the output that once required an entire department, the next question becomes unavoidable. Not, who gets the job, but why would the company hire the department in the first place? That's where we're going next. Why companies will stop hiring,